All right, I think we have enough people to get started. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ryan Hall. I am the Director of Marketing for Lighthouse AI, a pharma solutions company. We welcome you to today's webinar, State Licensing 101 for the Pharmaceutical Professional. Before we dive into the main content, we'd like to provide you with some additional information to ensure that you have a smooth and enjoyable webinar experience. First, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand at a later date. We'll send an email tomorrow morning with the webinar recording. By default, all attendees' audio and video are muted to minimize background noise and distractions. The chat function is also disabled for today's webinar. However, you can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A feature, which is a button at the bottom of your window. Feel free to submit questions at any time. So let's introduce today's speakers. Joining us today is Kelly DeBattista, Esquire. She is Lighthouse AI's Director of Regulatory Research. Kelly is an admitted New York attorney and brings nearly 10 years of regulatory and compliance experience in the pharmaceutical, life sciences, and pharmacy industries. Also on today's webinar is Darren O'Brien. Darren is the Vice President of Revenue for Lighthouse AI and leads both of our sales and marketing teams. Just a quick legal disclaimer before we get into it. First and foremost, Lighthouse AI is not a law firm and does not provide legal advice. The information provided is subject to change and is intended for informative industry knowledge. So just want to get that out of the way. Thank you. And we'll cover the agenda and then dive into everything. Today we're going to cover state licensing basics. We'll provide an overview of requirements by different business models. We'll also overview challenges of state licensing that affects pretty much everybody in the industry. And then we'll go over a survey of states to talk about costs, difficulty of different states, and general timelines. And we'll wrap things up with consequences of non-compliance with state licensing. Now that we have all that covered, let's get started. I'm going to kick things over to Darren, who's going to get us started with the basics. Darren?
All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. Since we're covering the basics, let's take it all the way back to the genesis of state licensing, which is this. State licensing and state licensing changes start with legislation, which is created and passed by a state's legislature. Once the law is enacted, the agency develops detailed rules and regulations to implement the law's intent. These rules outline specific requirements for licensing, and once adopted, the rules then carry the force of law. The regulatory agency then enforces these rules through licensing processes, routine inspections, and investigations. So that is the genesis and the start of all state licensing and state licensing changes. Now, some state licensing and regulatory entities are housed within agencies like the Department of Public Health, Consumer Protection, and Professional Licensing. Often these agencies will have regulatory bodies. The most common state licensing regulatory body is the State Board of Pharmacy. Today, the pharma supply chain consists of manufacturing, distribution, and 3PL services. Some or all may fall under the same regulatory framework as pharmacies, or they may fall under a different agency. So for example, Louisiana has the Louisiana Board of Drug and Device Distributors, but pharmacy is regulated by the Louisiana Board of Pharmacy. Making matters more complicated, some states have yet another different agency that regulates controlled substances, and sometimes a different one for devices. These agencies issue the licenses for facilities in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Agencies issue licenses at the facility level, not the company level, because different locations equal different risks from the regulator's perspective, and therefore a need for individual regulation. And these agencies issue both home state licenses and non-resident licenses. A state agency will issue home state licenses to facilities physically located within their state, and the same agency then will issue non-resident licenses to facilities physically located outside of their state. So those are the two kind of basics of home state versus non-resident state licensing. So with that, let's talk about home state licensing first. A facility must obtain a home state license in the state in which the facility is physically located for two main reasons. First, home states require facilities to hold a license, and second, non-resident states require facilities to hold a home state license in order to obtain those non-resident licenses. Now, the first of those two reasons is easy to explain, right? Agencies require most facilities in the state to hold a license. That's it. That's all there is to explain. Now, but notice I said most facilities instead of all facilities, because some states don't license all business models, meaning that some facilities in the pharmaceutical supply chain do not need to hold a license in their home state. We'll hear more about this later in the webinar. When a home state does not issue a home state license for a facility, that can create problems for the facility when seeking to obtain licenses in non-resident states. Because as I said, the second reason facilities must obtain home state licenses is that non-resident states require facilities to hold licenses in their home state. In this case, the facility must obtain an exemption letter from the home state to provide to non-resident states when applying for non-resident licenses. Most states will provide an exemption letter, but if your home state won't provide an exemption letter, you can try to provide the non-resident state your home state's regulatory language that indicates your home state does not require your facility to be licensed, because that's what would be covered by the exemption letter provided by the home state anyhow. Now, with all that said, you could still face complications with agencies in other states, even with an exemption letter, because, for example, New York will not license facilities without a home state license, even with an exemption letter, because that's the requirement in the statute. Now, one more note about home state licenses. A home state will conduct an inspection of the facility as part of the license application process. To prepare for the inspection, you should make sure to thoroughly review the inspection or self-inspection forms posted on your home state's website. And to be clear, I mean the licensing agency in your home state. Specifically, use these forms to guide your facility setup, because the inspector will very likely use a similar form when conducting your facility inspection. And be sure to look in the regulations to see if there are any other specific criteria for your facility type, such as square footage. All right, that's the 101 on home state licenses. So next, I'm going to move on to the non-resident licenses. In addition to your home state license, you'll need a non-resident license in the states in which your products are sold or shipped. And some states require manufacturers with their name on the label to hold licenses in their state, even if their product simply ends up in the state. Meaning the facility still requires a license, even if the facility did not directly sell or ship product into the state. When applying for licenses in non-resident states, many non-resident agencies must verify your existing licensure as part of the processing of your application, including your home state license and other non-resident licenses. Non-resident agencies will verify licenses in one of two ways. First, some agencies rely on the license lookup feature on other agency websites. And second, some agencies require you to obtain a certified license verification and a sealed envelope from the agencies that issued your existing licenses. You'll want to request these license certifications early because agencies take time to provide these certifications. As part of the application process, a few states require background checks for owners and officers, as well as designated reps or pharmacists in charge. Some states that require background checks require a federal background check. On the other hand, some states require state background checks, and you probably guessed it, some require both. Background checks can differ in scope in two ways. First is the type of criminal history, and the second is the period of time of history that's reported. So first, let me explain type. Some state regulations are very specific regarding the types of criminal history they want to be reported, which typically includes federal or state law relating to possession, control, or wholesale distribution of prescription drugs, or any involvement with any business, including any investments that manufactured, administered, prescribed, wholesale distributed, or stored prescription drugs. That's type of history. And then in terms of time, states differ. So for example, Wyoming only requires reporting during the past 7 years, but Utah requires reporting during the past 10 years. All right. I've covered license verifications and background checks. To cover some more of the basics, I want to talk about ancillary requirements. And specifically, I'll talk about 4 concepts: surety bonds, reporting requirements, foreign qualifications, and registered agents. Surety bonds are required as a prerequisite for wholesaler distributor licenses in about 15 states. They guarantee the state agency can collect monetary compensation if necessary. The cost is typically 1% of the value of the bond per year. So for example, a $100,000 bond will net a $1,000 per year fee. Another ancillary requirement is federal reporting. Having a state license means you will also comply with federal reporting requirements. So for example, distributors and 3PLs have annual FDA reporting requirements. A more universal requirement in many states is a foreign qualification. A foreign qualification registers an entity with the Secretary of State in a non-resident state. And in most cases, you must also have a registered agent for your foreign qualification. At least 26 states require a registered agent in their state as a prerequisite to licensure. All right, that covers the ancillary requirements for non-resident licenses. So we've covered home state licenses, non-resident licenses, and now I want to talk about personnel licenses, including both designated representatives and pharmacists in charge. First, let's talk about designated representatives. Facilities must name a designated representative or facility manager on license applications. A designated representative, also known as a DR, is an individual appointed by a company to act as the official point of contact for regulatory and compliance matters. Some states have an education requirement for the DR and want the applicant to submit transcripts indicating a high school diploma was completed or proof that a GED was completed, in addition to the work experience. DRs require their own personal license in Alabama, California, and Florida, and Idaho has a formal registration requirement. To obtain a DR license in California, a DR must first complete a California online training program, and to obtain a DR license in Florida, DRs must pass an in-person test, which consists of questions that pertain to the Florida regulations of wholesale distribution. So everything I just said applies to DRs, but now let me talk about pharmacists in charge, otherwise known as PIC. There are currently 18 states that require the PIC of a non-resident pharmacy to be licensed in their state. 2 states require registration, and those being Idaho and Iowa. Beginning January 1st, Illinois will require a non-resident pharmacy's PIC to be licensed in their state as well. All right, that covers the basics of licensing, including home state licenses, non-resident licenses, personnel licenses, and ancillaries such as background checks, foreign qualifications, registered agents, and surety bonds. And we'll pause for just a minute. I'll pass it over to Ryan for a quick poll question.
All right, everyone. We're going to launch a few polls during the webinar today to just get some more information and engagement from the audience. It's always kind of unique to see the data since we have different audiences. So let's see on the webinar today, what is your level, or what would you gauge your level of expertise as for state licensing? This is a one-on-one webinar, so we do expect a lot of people new to state licensing. However, we found that a lot of people just like to get a quick refresher or maybe see if there's some things they missed, in their initial education on state licensing. So thank you. I see a lot of people already answering the poll. I'll share the results now. Thank you, everybody. Be kind of curious to see. It's kind of fun here. Good. All right. It's actually a larger mix of intermediate to maybe even expert on today's webinar, which is great to see. And we do have some folks that are brand new to state licensing or just want to kind of dive a little deeper. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's always interesting to see who we have on. Perfect. I'm going to pass things over now to Kelly, who's going to talk about specific business models.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'm going to cover a few different business models that are pretty popular in the supply chain. And part of those business models are the underlying factors that, determine the business model. So a big one is ownership versus possession. So that's a pretty huge factor when determining what type of business model we're actually looking at. but it is a common area of confusion. It's also extremely important in determining many aspects of your license type with the boards. So it's a foundational building block to understanding state licensing, the concept of ownership of a product versus possession or both. For example, a 3PL has possession of a product, but does not have ownership of that product. A virtual manufacturer or a virtual wholesaler has ownership, but no possession of the product. And a traditional wholesaler has both. They'll physically possess the product and they will have ownership of the product, thereby the ability to sell that product. Some states won't require a license if you possess the product, but you don't own it. So exempting 3PLs, for example. And to the same extent, some states won't require a license if you own the product, but you don't possess it. So exempting virtuals. So who owns the product when it enters the state versus who's physically shipping the product into a state can make all the difference in whether or not you're exempt or you require a license. So on that note, whether or not the companies you're working with as a virtual and whether or not they're licensed in a given state can also make a difference, because some states will want to know the name of your 3PL if you're a virtual or your CMO. So it's a trickle-down effect as far as licensure goes. But then again, so are the exemptions. So an example of that is Kentucky. So if you're a non-resident virtual manufacturer, but your 3PL is licensed to ship into Kentucky, you're exempt from a license. Whereas if you're physically not, well, your office is physically in that state, so you're a resident of Kentucky, you do need a license. So those are just the different types of nuances that can come up as far as exemptions from licensure or requirements for a license. Touching product, shipping product, or owning product are all major factors and related to different business models. So it really comes down to your activity and your product type. The first business model we're going to touch on here is manufacturers. So there's a lot of additional compliance and regulatory requirements that come with being a manufacturer, which we'll touch on, but manufacturers need to be FDA registered. And many of the boards want proof of your FDA registration before they'll issue you a license in that state. So because traditional manufacturers will have already met the FDA requirements to be registered, many of your requirements in a given state are already completed. So the obstacles to state licensure may be less so at this point for manufacturers versus other business activities. However, manufacturers often have additional obstacles or requirements rather that other business models don't have. So federal reporting is an example, drug price transparency reporting to states, opioid taxes, opioid reporting, sales rep reports, or participation in drug take-back programs. The FDA will also issue a Form 483 for observations made during an inspection, which will need to be corrected. And sometimes the state licensing agencies will also act on that 483. So there's a bigger impact there than just with the FDA. And some additional examples of specific state regulation related to manufacturers are California doesn't require a license actually if you're a non-resident manufacturer, but the exemption applies to manufacturers distributing product that they have physically manufactured. So this is in their Article 11 of the Business and Professions Code, and it states, a drug manufacturer premises licensed by the Food and Drug Administration or licensed pursuant to Section 111615 of the Health and Safety Code that only distributes dangerous drugs and dangerous devices of its own manufacturer is exempt from this section in Section 4161. So this leaves virtuals most likely not covered by that exemption because they're not selling a product of their own manufacturer. It's typically manufactured by a third party like a CMO. But it is definitely a gray area. Pennsylvania recently opted to license in-state virtual manufacturers, which is a huge benefit to those virtual entities with the resident state of PA due to their ability to now obtain a home state license, making licensure elsewhere much easier. So after April 13th of this year, in-state virtuals that hold FDA commercial product are required to obtain license. For Pennsylvania-based virtuals, they can obtain licensure now in states such as New York that won't accept anything less than an actual reciprocal home state license. The next business model we're going to discuss here is virtual distributors, not virtual, sorry, wholesale distributors. Wholesale distributors are almost always required to hold a non-resident state license. In every state, with the exception of Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Hawaii, there are some nuances to that where one of those states may require a license, specifically Pennsylvania, but we'll get to that now, because if you have sales reps, which is also known in PA as boots on the ground, so physical presence in the state, even if your facility is non-resident of PA, or if you have pseudoephedrine, Pennsylvania will require a non-resident license for you. But overall, Pennsylvania, Hawaii, and Massachusetts don't require a license for most wholesalers. And since wholesalers are such an integral part of how product moves through the supply chain, they can be very susceptible to fines and penalties. So you have to be really careful as a wholesaler where you're shipping and whether you're properly licensed to ship into that state, which is why we recommend that you should really be licensed in all states and jurisdictions where possible. So some state regulations may permit an agency to fine per item per day, which can end up in the thousands. An example of that is Alabama, which has a civil penalty as much as $4,000 per violation. So that really adds up. Now we're going to talk about virtuals. So virtual manufacturers and virtual wholesalers are a little more complex than some of the other business models we've covered. There are currently 39 states that license virtual manufacturers with the recent addition of Pennsylvania, and there are 40 that license virtual wholesalers. So if you're virtual, your home state might not issue a license for you, in which case there's often an exemption letter that you have to provide other regulatory agencies, or as Darren mentioned earlier, provide a section of the statute and the regulations that specifically exempts you. Sometimes a non-resident state, as we mentioned, New York, won't even accept this. They want to see an actual license that they can reciprocate in that state. Other states will want to know your CMO's license number or your 3PL's license number on the application as part of their process. So if you don't have a CMO or a 3PL that's licensed in a state that you're trying to apply for a license in, you have to either stop shipping, find a new vendor, or you're going to end up having to put a pause on doing business in that state altogether. So that could be another roadblock if you're a virtual entity. A lot of virtuals utilize title model. It's been pretty popular. It is a faster way to get your product to market. If you have an FDA approved product, it's ready to go, but you don't want to wait for the timing that it takes for all these states to actually issue you a license. It is one model that a lot of virtuals utilize in order to get that product out there, but it is a little bit complicated because although you are not selling into a state, some states still want a license from you just because you're on the label of the product. So others are only concerned with who's selling or who's shipping that product, but there are a handful, a good number of states actually, probably around 20 or so, that consider the fact that since you are manufacturer of record, you're on the label of the product, they want some sort of license from you or some sort of accountability for that product in the state. So it's not as though the 3PL is taking title and then you're absolved of any sort of responsibilities in all the states. It's definitely not that simple. An additional hurdle for virtuals could be the states where the activity is licensed, but the state doesn't really make a distinction between a virtual entity and an entity that physically handles product. So the inspection requirements can be inconsistent if you don't have any product on site, and this could be really confusing for how to set up for an inspection. One example of this is in New Jersey. Their regulations basically state all facilities at which drugs are stored, warehoused, handled, held, offered, marketed, or displayed have to be of suitable size and construction to facilitate cleaning, maintenance, and proper operations, provide storage areas with adequate lighting, ventilation, temperature, sanitation, etc. Quarantine area for storage of outdated, damaged, deteriorated, misbranded, or adulterated drugs, or drugs that are in immediate or sealed secondary containers that have been opened, and it must be in a space that's maintained in a clean and orderly condition and free from infestation by insects, rodents, birds, vermin, etc. So a couple of those are, I think, realistic expectations for any sort of office space, like suitable size, construction. Quarantine area, not so much, because you don't have any product if you're virtual. So what are you really quarantining? Being free from infestation, yeah, I think any office space, that makes sense. But as a virtual, it's unrealistic to a certain extent to have to meet every single one of those expectations for inspection, especially if you don't have product to quarantine. You don't have a need for, humidity, space, equipment, security conditions of any product. But that's still what's required, as far as New Jersey is concerned anyway. And lastly, virtuals should always keep in mind how long the process takes to obtain a license in a given state, what roadblocks exist, whether that be your CMO needing a license, your 3PL needing a license, prerequisites, attachments, certain registrations that virtuals aren't able to obtain by, just due to the fact that they're virtual. Any kind of inspection requirements that might fall outside of the norm due to the fact that business is virtual. So it is a little bit more complex as far as virtuals go. Not all states, I think, fully, I don't want to say understand, but they don't all carve out an actual license type for virtuals with an actual definition for virtuals. Some will license them anyway, and some will exempt them, and some actually do have that carved out. So it's kind of a mixed bag when it comes to virtuals. The next business model that we're going to talk about is third-party logistics providers. So wholesalers and third-party logistics providers, also known as 3PLs, are fundamentally different in that 3PLs never take title to product, so they're not really selling product, and wholesalers do. So because of that fundamental difference, if a 3PL is actually selling third-party product, or a wholesaler is distributing but not selling product, two separate licenses are often required for the different business activities happening due to that ownership and possession aspect. One state that previously didn't license 3PLs is Wisconsin. Now resident and non-resident 3PLs may obtain a license. And there are still a handful of states that will license the 3PL as a wholesaler, although I think that's decreasing because with DSCSA, that's going to have to change, whether it be exempting 3PLs altogether or creating and carving out a new license requirement and a license type for a 3PL. But ultimately, 3PLs play an integral role in the supply chain, especially for virtual entities, whether a virtual is utilizing title model or selling into the states itself. 3PLs are the business that is physically getting that product into a state and getting it to the consumers. So they fill a huge need for those entities that aren't shipping product themselves, whether it be by virtue of the fact that they're virtual or, simply don't have that kind of setup. Even a manufacturer that's manufacturing its own product might not be doing its own distribution. So they do fill a huge need in the supply chain. So now that we've gone over 3PLs, wholesalers, manufacturers, and virtual entity types, I'm going to pass it back over to Darren to go over some state licensing challenges.
All right. Ryan and Kelly, I'm going to go a bit faster through this section than I had planned on. So Kelly, I'll be turning it back over to you soon. In terms of challenges, there's a lot of different challenges with state licensing. And so we don't have time to cover all of them, but I do want to talk about the root cause of almost every problem with state licensing. And that is this: the root cause of almost every state license challenge is the inability to pin down the state licensing information you need to make determinations about obtaining, maintaining, and changing licenses. Said another way, the state licensing information you need is scattered, inconsistent, ambiguous, incomplete, obscured, and constantly changing. And that's what I mean about the inability to pin down the data that you need to obtain, maintain, and change licenses. So here's what I mean. By scattered, that information that you need if you're doing business across the 50 states and DC, Puerto Rico, I mean, that state licensing information you need is scattered across over 80 agencies' websites, across multiple web pages and documents on those sites, and even scattered across statutes and rules. By inconsistent, of course, I mean definitions, rules, requirements, and even the list of controlled substances differs from agency to agency. And while there's a lot that's similar, there's a lot that's different from agency to agency, both within the same state and especially across different states. By ambiguous, I mean that information is unclear and therefore inconclusive. For example, fundamental words such as distribute and drug can mean many different things. And they do mean many different things across different agencies and states. Yet, those words are not clearly defined or scoped as often as they should be. By incomplete, I mean critical information doesn't exist anywhere in writing, forcing you to call to get clarification that agencies sometimes can't, won't, don't provide. By obscured, I mean the information you need is often buried in longer documents, especially statutes and rules, ranging from documents with 500 words to documents with 500 pages. And yes, all that information that you need to manage your state licensing, which is something like 15,000 data points, that information is constantly changing. And while you may be compliant today, something can change tomorrow that will make you non-compliant, if not tomorrow, when it comes time to renew or change a license. Now, I point that out because those 6 root causes, really the one root cause of the inability to pin down information, is ultimately what creates incomplete, incorrect, and late state licensing. And that is the big challenge with state licensing. And again, by incomplete, let me just quickly clarify, I won't go into examples, but by incomplete, I mean a facility doesn't hold licenses that it should hold, doesn't renew licenses that it needs to renew because that information kind of got dropped, lost, forgotten, and doesn't change licenses that need to be changed, whether someone didn't know that the change was a reportable change or didn't communicate it to you because they didn't think it mattered. And then by incorrect, of course, I mean submitting applications incorrectly, which can happen for all these reasons listed here on the screen and many, many more. And then last but not least, doing things late can happen for a number of reasons because a task didn't get started on time and now somebody is out of town and not going to be back to sign the paperwork that needs to be signed and submitted, or a document you were to submit as part of an application is outdated and you just now realized it. So there's a lot of challenges with state licenses that really can all be traced back to the inability to pin down the information that you need when you need it. And that's the challenge. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan for another poll question.
All right, thanks so much, Darren. So everyone, another poll question for you. This should be up on the screen now. We're again curious to learn a little bit about everyone on the webinar today. We're wondering what areas that you generally outsource to a vendor or third party. These could be ones that you find particularly challenging, can't find the correct documentation for through the boards of pharmacy or other regulatory agencies, or possibly you just don't have the time on top of all your other responsibilities and day-to-day. So go ahead and fill out the poll now. We'll take a look at the results like we did last time. Curious to see what everyone submits. Perfect. All right, I'm going to stop the poll. Thank you, everyone. A good mix across the board, actually. But it looks like there might be a clear winner in monitoring for new and changing requirements, which is definitely a difficult area. Keeping up with all the changes across all 50 states, plus all the different jurisdictions. So that's not super surprising, but good confirmation there. Looks like a lot of other folks are outsourcing change notifications, assessments, and so on. Perfect. Thanks again, everyone, for your participation. Always love looking at this data. Great. So I'm going to hand it back over to Kelly next, who's going to talk about survey of states, including timelines, costs, and difficulty. So Kelly, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. So as Ryan mentioned, there's several surveys we're going to look at. The first one is state licensing timelines. There are 3 areas that can impact licensure. Those are the time frame, the fees, and the difficulty in obtaining a license due to the requirements of a particular state. Difficulty can come in the form of DDA accreditation as a prereq or finding a licensed DR in states like California, Florida, or Alabama. Regarding timeframes, the average application takes 34 months from submission to approval. Some states are a bit slower, and examples of those jurisdictions are California, DC, and Florida. Florida takes about 90 days. DC is more on the 120-day end of the spectrum. And California says, don't ask about your app for at least 30 days, but typically takes closer to 90 days to process. And that's assuming, everything is submitted, there's no deficiencies, there's nothing, that the board is requiring in addition to what you've submitted to verify as far as, background issues or penalties or what have you. So that's best case scenario. Those examples are all on the slide here of what's slower and what's faster. Some of the faster states are Arkansas, Connecticut, West Virginia. That just, is again a result of what's required in those states in order to get that license processed. Connecticut, for example, if you're a manufacturer, it's a one-time registration. There's no renewal. It's done online. So it's a state-by-state distinction there. So state licensing difficulty. What we said previously was what makes a state more difficult is the type or the amount of requirements and the information needed to meet those requirements as part of the application process. And gathering accurate and thorough information from the correct person in your company or people can be extremely tricky or time consuming. So like we said earlier, some business models might have additional requirements depending on the state. For example, at least 10 states currently require controlled substance reporting for particular business models. And manufacturers must also report prescription drug price increases in about 22 states, with more states increasingly following this trend. Some states go above and beyond the average with regard to complexity or the number of requirements. Those states, again, California, Florida, and then Missouri and Maryland are amongst those. There are others. And states that are a little less stringent with requirements are Arkansas, Connecticut again, and West Virginia. Now, the cost, it varies state by state, but the average cost is not, it's usually between $500 and $750 as the median for an application. Sometimes this is much, much higher when you roll in additional fees. If you're obtaining a controlled substance license, which is separate from your license for your business model, or a designation may cost additional money. I think in Alabama, for example, it's like an additional $600 in addition to the $700 or $750 license fee for controlled substances. There might be fees for a designated representative registration or fingerprinting, background checks, etc. So we're talking the license fee. Some states that cost less than $750 usually are Arkansas, Hawaii, Indiana, Kansas, and New Jersey. And some of the more expensive states are generally because of the additional fees or requirements are Alabama, Florida, Minnesota, and New York. So that covers the complexities of state licensing, and I'll pass it back over to Darren now to go over the consequences of noncompliance.
All right. There are three main consequences of noncompliance. And by noncompliance, I mean a facility does not hold a license or does not hold licenses it should hold. A facility does not renew licenses it should renew, and a facility does not report changes it should report. The different consequences include fines, revenue loss, and reputational damage. I'll start with fines. When an agency disciplines a facility, agencies often issue fines, not always, but often. And the average fine is around $1,000. However, we've seen fines much higher than $1,000. For example, Arkansas has fined up to $10,000 for a late notification of a change of ownership. Further, some agencies have issued fines that multiply per item per day shipped into the state, totaling far more than $10,000. So the fine amount is one dimension of elasticity in terms of kind of the increasing consequence. The other dimension is what is known as domino discipline. So here's what I mean by domino discipline. If one agency disciplines your facility, you're supposed to report the discipline to the other agencies with whom your facility holds licenses. One or more of the other agencies may also discipline your facility because of your noncompliance that led to discipline in the other state. Meaning instead of one fine, you receive multiple fines, and that's the domino discipline. While fines can add up quickly, they don't add up as fast as lost revenue, which is the second consequence. Lost sales revenue can quickly total $250,000 in one state due to one instance of non-compliance. Therefore, lost sales revenue is a problem that is literally 250 times greater than fines. Facilities lose revenue because they must stop selling or stop shipping into a state in which they are non-compliant. Facilities stop doing business in states in which they are non-compliant because agencies require facilities to stop doing business when someone discovers the non-compliance. More specifically, facilities voluntarily stop because agency discipline is far worse for known non-compliance versus unknown non-compliance. And then on the screen, you can see how non-compliance can total up over $250,000 very quickly. According to our market research, the typical facility with $75 million of annual revenue will lose approximately $280,000 of revenue each year over the next 5 years due to non-compliance with state licensing requirements. Again, by the requirements or non-compliance, I'm talking about, the requirement to obtain a license, to renew it, and to change it. That's where the non-compliance is. And if a facility is 10% non-compliant across those three types, they're actually non-compliant in 30% of the states in which they do business. And that's because non-compliance is cumulative. And so, again, that's not something people know is happening. It's almost always unknown. But when it's found, right, there's a decision to be made. And sometimes the decision is made for you because it's found by the state or it's found by one of your customers. Now, when that happens, non-compliance, 30% of states, that's 15 states if you're doing business in 50 states. And if 20% of that total non-compliance is caught, that means the facility will temporarily lose revenue in 3 states over the next 5 years. Not just 3 states over the next 5 years. That could be 1 state in 1 year or year 1, no state in year 2, 1 state in year 3, no state year 4, 1 state in year 5. That would equate still to $283,000 per year, assuming it takes an average of 3 months to correct. And we hear about this frequently. And that's why lost revenue is a significant consequence of non-compliance. The third and final consequence I'll point out is reputational damage. Non-compliance damages your reputation with customers and licensing agencies. And by customers, I mean both the consumers, the patients, and trading partners. Because nowadays, when a patient is interested in a product, they look it up on the internet, and you don't want a potential client's first interaction with your company to be a scathing review of how your specialty pharmacy failed to ship their prescription because you weren't licensed correctly. And so that's what I mean there. Now, with reputational damage with trading partners, here's what I mean. In addition to receiving discipline from state boards, your company will have discipline attached to its license with the state board that issued it. And with the exception of letters of concern or warnings, discipline is generally public information, is also listed on state board websites for the public to view, including potential trading partners. And some agencies post discipline on their websites for 10 years, like in Utah. And beyond the website, some agencies choose to place discipline in their state's quarterly newsletter. Now, that, right, is just reporting the news. But beyond that, trading partners will definitely hold it against you if you can't ship their orders because you were non-compliant with state licensing requirements, especially if your customers found the non-compliance themselves. We've had customers that come to us ready to do whatever it takes to get their state licensing in order because they just lost a customer due to their non-compliance. And that's what I mean by reputational damage with trading partners. And finally, of course, non-compliance will damage your reputation with the state agencies because every application will ask, has your facility had disciplinary action taken against you? And you've got to check that box every time. And that's how non-compliance damages your reputation with customers and licensing agencies. All right.
Apologies,
Oh.
technical difficulty there. Sorry, Darren. All right, Kelly and Darren, thank you so much for all that incredible information. What we'd like to do now, everyone, is show you our Lighthouse AI state licensing software and how it helps you solve many of the challenges that we just reviewed today. Darren is going to guide us through a quick 5-minute demonstration, and then we'll move on to the questions and answer section, which I know everyone wants to get to. I'm sure you all have your own state licensing questions. So just a reminder, if you haven't already, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your window. Submit your questions there, and we'll get to those right after the demo. Darren, are you ready to go for the demo?
Absolutely. I'll jump in.
Perfect.
You heard me earlier talk about the fact that state licensing information that you need is information that's scattered, it's inconsistent, it is ambiguous, it's incomplete, it is obscured, and it's constantly changing. And as a result, it's difficult and sometimes impossible to pin down the information that you need to make determinations as it relates to state licensing. We built the Lighthouse AI software to solve that root cause problem. The Lighthouse state licensing software is your single source of truth for state licensing, both your internal information and that external regulatory information. The state licensing software that I'll show you today centralizes, standardizes, and fills in the gaps of all that state licensing information to eliminate as many as possible, but most of the problems that cause state licensing non-compliance. And as a result, that's why the Lighthouse AI software helps you reduce your financial risk of non-compliance with state licensing requirements by 99.9%. And specifically how the software does that is in these three themes: by helping you discover overlooked requirements, reduce avoidable deficiencies, and eliminate lost and forgotten tasks. I'll show you how the software delivers each of these three benefits, starting with how the software helps you discover overlooked state licensing requirements. Companies overlook licensing requirements for two big reasons. First, they incorrectly capture facility attributes, and second, they incorrectly determine licensing requirements. Our software solves the problem to create both of these challenges. When I say facility attributes, I'm referring to a facility's business model, product types, and the jurisdictions in which those products are sold, shipped, or even simply end up in. State licensing professionals must correctly and completely capture these facility attributes, and that's because these attributes determine which state licenses each facility must obtain for each agency and each jurisdiction. Yet, most capture 30% of their attributes incorrectly, causing them to capture their licensing requirements incorrectly. And the Lighthouse AI Facility Assessment Questionnaire solves this problem. And once the questionnaire is complete, our software automatically runs an assessment looking for matches between your facility attributes and the 700 plus state licenses cataloged inside the software. And by matches, I mean licenses you must hold because of your facility's business model, products, and the jurisdictions in which you sell or ship those products. The software lists each required license in each row and provides critical information about each license in each column. These assessments eliminate the problems that cause state licensing personnel to incorrectly determine 10% of their license requirements. And because licensing requirements change each year across all agencies and all jurisdictions, our research team and AI tools continuously crawl agency websites, applications, state and federal legislation, state agency guidance documents, and agency FAQs. Our research team and technology immediately update the back end of the Lighthouse AI software to reflect the changes they find, and then the software continuously reruns the assessment looking for matches between all your facility attributes and any new or newly required licenses that may have popped up. And while I don't have time to show you this today, please know our subscriptions also include change assessments. And by change assessments, I mean the software automatically determines the change requirements for all your active licenses affected by a reportable change, such as a change of ownership, address, officer, designated rep, and so on. Now that covers how the Lighthouse AI software helps you discover overlooked requirements. But not only does the software help you discover overlooked requirements, it also helps you reduce avoidable deficiencies. Unlike agency websites, our software compiles into one place application details that are clear and complete for each license, and not obscured by the majority of information that isn't relevant to you. We compile the application name, definition, notes, processing time, renewal term, application type forms, citations, fees, attachments, and prerequisites. And finally, our software not only helps you reduce avoidable deficiencies and discover overlooked requirements, but our software helps you eliminate lost and forgotten tasks in the management module, which is what you're seeing on the screen now. Every row you see on the screen corresponds to one required license. And when you click on one of those licenses, the software organizes your open and complete tasks for each license into what we call activities shown on the right. By activities, we mean initials, renewals, and reportable changes. The software includes optional email notifications of new and expiring tasks, something especially beneficial for those that support your work in state licensing, but would not log into the software very often. And finally, last but not least, the management dashboard tracks your progress in managing your state licensing, including the status for licenses, upcoming renewals, expiring documents, and tasks. And that's all the time that I have. That's all I have time to show you today. But to summarize what I just showed you, remember, the Lighthouse AI software provides you what you need to reduce your financial risk of noncompliance with state licensing requirements by 99.9%. And that's because the software helps you discover overlooked requirements, reduce avoidable deficiencies, and eliminate lost and forgotten tasks.
So now we've got to the questions and answers section of the webinar. This is where you can ask us your own state licensing questions. Kelly and Darren are going to field some questions for us today. Again, just a reminder, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to submit your questions now and we'll take a look. Kelly, would you mind taking a look at some of the questions and pick out a few that you'd like to answer?
Sure. So one of the first question here is, with Hawaii being one of the states that doesn't require a wholesale license, what is required if controlled products are shipped into Hawaii? So from what I understand, Hawaii will still require a controlled substance registration if you're physically shipping controlled substances into the state. And that's a separate agency from the agency that would normally issue a license, like a wholesaler license, or that issues a wholesaler license to domestic entities in the state. So that is a little bit complicated because yes, you do need something for controlled substances, but no, you don't need something based on the fact that you're a wholesaler. So physically shipping, yes, you want to take that into consideration. There are a couple questions that I think Darren might be able to answer geared towards the software. I'm not sure if you could see those, Darren.
Yeah, I saw it. A question that came in asked, is your software set up for consultants to track multiple clients? The answer is yes. The word yet was put in there, so it sounds like there's probably some history of discussion with Lighthouse. So what I'll do is I'd love to, the person who wrote this in, fortunately, I can see who you were because it was not submitted anonymous. I'll reach out to you directly and figure out exactly kind of the nuance of your question. And if the setup makes sense, I'll connect you with the right folks. And if not, then the answer is no. But I just need to know exactly what setup for consultants means.
Okay. Do any states exempt virtual manufacturers from controlled substance registrations? Yes, there are. And I'm not able to list them out right now, but there are states that don't, because virtuals can't get a DEA registration from what I understand. So there are states that don't require that additional separate registration, and there are some states that still require it and will have that portion of the application left blank. There are states where it's simply just a designation on the application. So if you're a virtual that has controls in, in what you're selling, the state just wants to know that. So it's kind of a mixed bag there. But no, not all the states that have a separate registration will require it if you're virtual. But it's definitely something that you'd want to look into in greater detail. Because, even if it's not a separate fee, it might still be a designation that the state wants to be aware of and will list on your license when it's verifiable online.
Thank you, Kelly. Just one quick
sure. comment
on that. For the person that asked, I saw it was anonymous. If you want to send us a private message through our website, www.lighthouseai.com, we can dig into that further for you and reply after the webinar. It was submitted anonymously, so I just can't see the contact information for follow-up later. So thank you.
No problem. So I don't off the top of my head know, this question is what additional state is required, like the 39 versus 40, the virtuals. I don't believe it's Wyoming. There is one state that specifically exempts virtual manufacturers, but not wholesalers. I don't know the reasoning behind it. So I apologize, but I can't answer that off the top of my head at the moment. So I'm just going to go through the rest of these here. How can a virtual wholesaler pass inspection in California? Given that the state only issues traditional wholesale licenses and doesn't recognize a separate virtual license category. So yeah, like we said during the webinar, and we only have a couple minutes, so I'll make this quick. There is a non-resident manufacturer exemption if you're traditionally manufacturing your product. So you're physically manufacturing it, it's of your own manufacturer, shipping from your facility. So virtuals fall into that wholesaler license type in California as non-residents. And I would say a lot of inspection requirements that virtuals need to focus on, especially in states where they don't make that distinction, are things like record keeping, the size of the space. Those are all probably policies and procedures. Those are things that are going to be more geared towards virtuals for an inspection. Not so much, your quarantine area and things like that. Although it still has to exist. But I do think that the states will want to pay attention to the aspects of your business that are most impacted by what you're doing, which is your record keeping, your policies and procedures, your still security requirements, because you still have, although you might not have product, you still have secure information on where that product is and how to get that product and what the product is. So there's things that you can't do just by virtue of the fact that you don't have any product, but you still have to follow those inspection requirements and guidelines the way they're written out, with more of a focus on the ones that do apply to you. And hopefully that answers that question. But we are at 1:59. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan.
Great. Thank you so much for answering everyone's questions, Kelly. If anyone has additional questions, unfortunately, if we didn't have time to get to yours, contact information is up on the screen now. Visit our website, lighthouseai.com, or shoot us an email at hello@lighthouseai.com. We'll answer those questions and follow up with you after the webinar. So we've reached time. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your interest. We hope to see you on future webinars, and we'll see some of you on the software demo next week. Have a great day. See you next time. Thank you.